A dying German shepherd wrapped herself around a baby and waited for someone to care. On a frozen Montana morning, a police officer found paw prints leading into the woods, but no human footsteps. What he discovered in the snow would change not just one life, but three. A dying German shepherd had wrapped her body around a newborn, silently guarding her through the night. Why did she stay? And why did the officer choose not to walk away? This is a story for anyone who's ever been forgotten, and for those who chose love anyway. If you're someone who believes in quiet courage, second chances, and the kind of family that chooses you, watch until the end. Tell us, have you ever been saved by someone who simply didn't leave under the pale hush of a Montana January night? The world had gone still. The kind of stillness that made your ears ring and your breath feel too loud. Snow pressed against every surface, softening rooftops, muffling fence posts, and settling into the grooves of the empty two-lane road that ran along the edge of Great Falls. Officer Graham Mercer guided his patrol cruiser along that road with the caution of someone not in a hurry, not really headed anywhere. The dashboard glowed faint blue against the dim interior, and the radio remained quiet. No chatter, no calls, just the low hum of tires over ice-hardened pavement. In the back seat, Solace lay curled, her breath fogging the window glass with each slow exhale. She'd stopped reacting to the occasional crackle of the police scanner weeks ago. Now she simply listened with her whole body, ears flicking subtly, muscles at ease but never unaware. Graham glanced in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were open, barely, just enough. That was the way with Solace, always present, never demanding. He adjusted the heater slightly, more out of habit than discomfort. The cabin was always cold this time of year, and it had long since stopped bothering him. Cold had a way of keeping things simple, predictable, unlike people, unlike memory. A low-hanging fog had begun to stretch across the road when he spotted it, something in the snow that didn't belong. Not an animal, not trash, but a pattern. Tracks. He slowed, easing the cruiser to the side, tires crunching delicately. They weren't car tracks. They weren't even boots. Dog prints. But what caught him wasn't that they were fresh. It was that they were alone. No human trail alongside, no overlapping pattern of leash drag. Just one set of pads pressed deeply into the snow, weaving across the roadside and disappearing toward the timberline. Solace sat up. Graham noticed her ears go forward, not stiff, but alert. She looked at the tracks, then at him. No sound. Just presence. He stepped out into the cold. The air bit his skin the moment the door closed behind him. Snowflakes sifted through the air like sifted flour, slow and fine. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting the quiet tell him what it could. The forest loomed in the near distance, dark and waiting. Somewhere in the pines, those tracks led forward. But to what? Solace jumped down without being told. She didn't bark, didn't rush. She stood next to him, tail low, posture quiet. They followed. The snow deepened as they left the road. Graham moved slowly, his boots pressing deliberate tracks next to the ones already there. Solace stayed close, her nose to the ground, but not tracking like a K9 would. More like reading. The moon slid behind a cloud, casting the clearing they entered in a gray wash. It was there as they came through a break in the trees that Graham paused. Something shifted in the air, not a noise but the absence of one. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but holding its breath. He squinted ahead, a small rise of snow, misshapen, still. Solace stopped walking. She didn't growl. She didn't step forward. She simply sat. Graham narrowed his eyes. The shape, it wasn't natural. It wasn't animal. He took another step forward. And there it was, a patch of darker fur against the white. A body curled tightly, unmoving, except for the rise and fall of shallow breath. And there, barely visible beneath its front leg, a glimpse of something else. A blanket? No. A tiny hand. Graham's breath caught, and he felt the cold hit deeper than before, not just the outside cold, but the kind that comes from the realization of something utterly human and utterly unexplainable. A dog curled around an infant in the snow. No shelter, no movement, no other signs of life. Just the quiet defiance of one creature refusing to leave another. He crouched slowly. Not too close, not yet. The dog lifted its head, just barely. Eyes met his. Brown, exhausted, and ancient in a way that didn't come from years, but from carrying too much in too little time. She didn't bark. She didn't show her teeth. She just looked, as if to ask, "Will you do what I couldn't finish?" Graham didn't answer. He just watched. And something inside him, not quite grief, not quite hope, moved for the first time in a long time. Who leaves a child in the snow and expects a dog to remember how to love? Or maybe the question was simpler. What kind of world lets it happen? He didn't move yet. He let the moment hold. There would be time for action, but some silences deserved to be heard. Graham remained crouched, the weight of the cold barely registering now as he stared into the eyes of the German shepherd curled around the infant. Snow collected on his shoulders, gathered in the creases of his uniform. But he didn't move. The dog's breathing was shallow. Every inhale seemed to cost her something. But she held her posture, tense and determined, as though if she shifted too much, the child beneath her might vanish. The baby didn't cry. That was the part that made the quiet worse. There was only the soft tremor of movement under the thin cotton blanket, the faintest sound of breath. Not strong enough for Montana's night air, not strong enough for much of anything. Graham slowly reached for the radio on his shoulder, keeping his eyes on the dog. His fingers brushed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer, Sector 8, he said, voice low, steady. "I need immediate medical response. Coordinates transmitting. Infant found in severe exposure, accompanied by unknown canine. Code 3. Repeat, Code 3. A crackle of static answered him, then the calm voice of the dispatcher. "Copy that, Officer Mercer. EMS en route. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. He looked at the infant again. The child was impossibly small, hands curled near its chest, skin nearly the same pale color as the snow. The dog, sensing the shift in his focus, shifted slightly, barely a motion, but it brought more of her body between him and the baby. Solace, who had remained behind him until now, stepped forward. Her movement was unhurried, deliberate. She walked slowly toward the other dog and stopped just short of her. No growl, no tension, just presence. Solace sat again, her tail curled neatly beside her, head tilted. The dog glanced at her, then back at Graham. That's when he noticed. The trembling had worsened. Not the baby, her. Hazel, he'd think to call her later, though that name hadn't arrived yet, was trembling not with fear, but with exhaustion. Her ribs showed just beneath the matted fur. Snow clung to her flanks. She wasn't just protecting the child. She was giving the last of herself to it. Graham pulled off his patrol jacket in one motion. He moved slowly, laying it open in front of him on the snow. Not trying to touch the child, not yet. Just an offering, warmth, color, intention. He spoke not to be understood, but to fill the silence with something less cruel. You did good, he murmured. You kept her breathing. The dog blinked, but didn't move. In the distance, the faint echo of sirens touched the stillness. The sound was small at first, barely audible through the trees, but Hazel heard it. Her ears twitched. She turned her head toward the noise, and something in her body seemed to let go. She lay down fully now, her legs folding beneath her. Solace took that as her moment. She stepped forward and settled herself beside Hazel, close but not pressing, just near enough for her warmth to pass between them. Graham watched the gesture. It wasn't canine instinct. It was something else, something quieter. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. The sirens grew louder. Graham knelt, his knees crunching the frost, and reached carefully toward the child. Hazel did not react. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, then opened again. He slipped one hand beneath the baby, lifting her gently from the makeshift nest of fur and snow and heartbreak. The child stirred faintly, a soft sound from her throat, like breath catching on the edge of a sob. That was when Graham's voice cracked. Not a loud sound, not even a word, just a breath he hadn't meant to take. He pressed the baby to his chest, wrapping her in his jacket, tucking the fabric around her tiny form, her head nestled into the crook of his arm like it had always belonged there. Like she remembered being held before. Behind him, emergency lights painted the snow in pulses of red and white. Paramedics rushed forward with a thermal blanket, medical kits, soft voices, and steady hands. One of them, a woman with a braid tucked beneath her beanie, reached for the baby with practiced calm. Graham hesitated, then passed her over. She's still warm, he whispered. Somehow. The medic nodded, her eyes flicking toward the dog still lying in the snow. And her? Graham looked back. Hazel hadn't moved. Her chest rose barely. Solace lay beside her, unmoving, watching. She's next, he said. They lifted Hazel onto a stretcher wrapped in fleece, her body slack but not limp. One of the paramedics tucked a hand gently under her muzzle to stabilize her breathing. Solace followed the movement with her eyes, but didn't get up. Stay, Graham said quietly. She did. The snow began falling again. Not hard, but steady. The kind of snow that fills in footprints, that erases the memory of who walked where and when. Graham stood alone in the clearing as the last of the lights faded toward the road. He watched them disappear, hands shoved in his pockets, the imprint of the baby still lingering in his arms. What kind of life had ended for this night to begin? And would anyone ever come looking? The emergency room at Great Falls Regional was quiet in that particular way only winter could make it. Lights low, machines humming softly, staff moving with practiced calm between curtained bays. It was past midnight when Graham stepped inside with his boots still damp and the cold still clinging to his collar. He hadn't gone home. The jacket he'd given up for the child hadn't been replaced, and he didn't ask for another. The chill helped keep something in him from settling or softening. They had placed the infant, now listed as Baby Jane Doe, in the ICU's warming crib. She lay under a blanket of medical-grade wool, her chest rising and falling with more strength than before, though her skin was still pale. The nurse on duty, a tall woman with hair in a tight braid and eyes that had seen too much, turned to Graham and nodded. Stable, she said. It's a good start. Graham didn't answer. He only stood by the window of the observation room, watching. His hand remained at his side, curled, like he'd forgotten how to unclench it. Across town, the animal control facility wasn't lit like the hospital. It didn't hum or glow. The lights buzzed in brief pulses of flicker, and the concrete floor never lost its cold no matter how high they turned the heat. Hazel had been brought in on a stretcher, wrapped in towels, her breathing shallow but steady. A temporary tag had been placed on her kennel. Unknown female German Shepherd, possible trauma. Solace was sitting in front of the kennel door. No leash had been required. No command had been given. After Hazel was laid on the blanket inside, Solace had followed the technician to the door, sat down, and remained still. She had not moved for an hour. The staff, 2 young women and an older man with tired hands, had tried coaxing her away with treats, with words, with gentle encouragement. She hadn't growled, she hadn't barked, but her body, her stillness, had made it clear. She was staying. One of the women made a bed of towels near the kennel door and laid a water bowl beside it. Solace didn't touch either, just stared at Hazel through the small glass window, as though watching over a story no one else could finish. At 2:35 a.m., Graham entered the facility. He hadn't planned to. He'd told himself he would go home after checking on the baby, maybe make coffee, maybe sleep. But the image of Solace, silent, unmoving, had pulled at him. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like the awareness of something unspoken that needed witnessing. The night shift manager, Joel, met him at the entrance with a tired smile and nodded toward the far corridor. "She hasn't budged," Joel said. "Neither of them. Thought maybe you'd want to take her home." Graham shook his head. "She's not ready to leave her yet." Joel studied him for a moment. "Neither are you, huh?" Graham didn't answer. He found Solace exactly as described, sitting like a statue before Hazel's kennel. Her tail was curled around her side, her eyes steady. She didn't look back at Graham when he approached, just blinked slowly, like acknowledging something understood but not discussed. Hazel, inside the kennel, looked smaller than she had in the snow. Her body, though covered, seemed to sink into itself now. No longer alert, no longer guarding, just still. Her ears twitched faintly at the sound of footsteps, and her chest rose once in a slow pull of breath. Graham sat on the towel beside Solace without a word. The concrete was cold beneath him, and the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old metal, but he didn't move. Minutes passed, or maybe more. A memory surfaced, unexpected, unwanted, of himself as a boy, no older than 6, staring through the metal rails of a group home bed, watching the way moonlight moved across the ceiling, wondering if his mother would come back, wondering if he should pretend she might. He hadn't cried. Not then. Not until days later when someone brought him a stuffed animal with torn ears and a note that didn't smell like her. Hazel stirred. Graham leaned slightly forward, but made no move to open the kennel. Solace did, though. She rose with care, stepped toward the door, and placed her nose gently against the seam in the glass. Hazel's eyes opened. Just a sliver, but enough. They didn't touch, but something passed between them, a flicker of presence, a reminder, a recognition. "Don't leave yet," Graham said softly, though he wasn't sure to whom he was speaking. He stayed until just before dawn, when the first light crept like smoke across the frost-edged windows. Solace had curled against the wall, still facing the kennel. Graham stood slowly, his legs stiff. He looked down at both dogs, and then at the silent hallway. Somewhere back at the hospital, the baby was alive. Somewhere back in the woods, footprints were already vanishing. And here, in the silence between one breath and the next, 2 creatures who had never been named by the world had found one another without needing to speak. Would anyone ever understand what it meant that they had stayed? 3 days passed. In the neonatal unit of Great Falls Regional, the baby's tiny fingers had begun curling with more intention, the soft monitors tracking her vitals, blinking in steadier rhythms. She had been assigned a temporary name, Hope, typed onto a plastic tag wrapped loosely around her ankle. Nurses called her that when passing by. The sound didn't seem out of place. Hope, as if something fragile was learning to hold on. No family had come forward, no calls, no missing persons reports. Just a bundle of breath and need found in the snow, and the question that no one could answer. Why was she left? Graham found himself returning, though no one asked him to. He came at odd hours, sometimes just to stand outside the glass, sometimes to leave a coffee on the nurse's desk without a word. He never stayed long, and yet he always lingered just enough to know the sound of her breath when she slept, the way her hands twitched in dreams. He'd never held a child before that night in the clearing, not even once, at the animal shelter. Hazel had not yet eaten. Despite fluids, warm bedding, and gentle coaxing, she remained in the same posture, curled inward, her body folded in on itself. There was no fight in her, only waiting. Solace had taken up silent residence beside her, never pushing, never pleading, only there. The shelter staff began making space around them, leaving towels and quiet. No music played in that section anymore, no clatter of bowls. On the fourth morning, Solace left Hazel's side for the first time. She walked to the entrance of the corridor and waited. The front doorbell chimed as Graham entered. Joel, the manager, looked up and gave a nod, already reaching for the keys. "She's been waiting," he said, not specifying who he meant. Graham followed Solace back to the kennel without speaking. He crouched. Hazel lifted her head, barely, but it was the first time she had moved on her own. "I want to bring her somewhere quieter," Graham said. "Not home, just somewhere that isn't concrete and metal." Joel hesitated. "She's technically under hold, but if she's not aggressive and you're registered, we can make it happen." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "You thinking of fostering?" "I'm not thinking anything," Graham replied, "just trying to keep something alive that wants to disappear." They transferred Hazel that afternoon. She was placed gently into the back seat of Graham's cruiser, wrapped in a fleece blanket. Solace jumped in beside her and lay down, her body curving slightly toward Hazel's without touching. The sun broke briefly through the clouds on the drive north. Snowdrifts lined the edge of the road like frozen waves. The cabin stood at the edge of town, away from traffic, tucked between a line of weathered pines. It wasn't large, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a screened porch that faced the hills. The heat took time to settle in. The stove groaned as it came to life, and Graham left water warming on the burner. He laid Hazel on a thick rug near the wood stove and placed a folded blanket beside her. Solace took her place nearby, resting her chin on her paws. For the first hour, no one moved. The stillness inside the cabin felt different from the stillness of snow. It wasn't cold. It wasn't empty. It just listened. That evening, Graham made soup. He wasn't sure why. Hazel wouldn't eat, and Solace never begged. But it filled the space. Steam curled from the pot as he sat at the small kitchen table, watching the fire flicker in the stove's belly. He placed a shallow bowl near Hazel. Just broth, nothing more. She didn't touch it, but she opened her eyes again, watched the way he moved. That night, Graham slept on the couch with a blanket over his chest and the silence pressing gently on his ribs. Solace lay nearby. Hazel didn't sleep. Not deeply, but she stayed. That was enough. The next morning, A call came from the hospital. Hope was improving, feeding regularly. Nurses said she had strong lungs. She'd cried loud enough to wake another infant in the unit. Graham listened to the report without interruption, then asked quietly if they needed anything. They didn't. But one nurse added, "She turns her head toward the window every time someone walks by, like she's waiting." He hung up without answering. Later that day, Hazel stood. It happened slowly, one leg, then another, shaking but firm. She took a step toward the window, paused, then lay back down. Solace followed her without sound. The blanket Graham had laid out had been pulled slightly by her motion, dragged toward the morning light that now came through the slats of the blinds. Something about the gesture, the pull of warmth, the seeking of brightness, made him stop what he was doing and just watch. There were no headlines for moments like that. No names. Just the quiet decision of a dog who had nearly died choosing, again, not to. Somewhere deep in the drawer of the kitchen, Graham found the hospital receipt with the baby's intake number. Typed in block letters beside it, patient status, undocumented, next of kin, unknown. He folded the paper carefully, put it in his coat pocket. Maybe no one was coming, but was that the same thing as being alone? Hope's crib was positioned near the west-facing window of the neonatal unit. Outside, the sky had taken on that late winter softness, where clouds no longer threatened, but instead simply lingered, shades of bone white and slate gray hanging low over the hills. Inside, the light shifted gently across the tiled floor, catching the edge of Hope's blanket, the tiny tag on her wrist, the near-translucent curve of her ear. She stirred in her sleep. Nurse Kelsey, who had taken a liking to the infant, lowered her voice without meaning to, speaking to another nurse nearby. "She's stronger today." There wasn't joy in her tone exactly, just reverence, the kind people use when speaking about small victories they're afraid to jinx. A knit beanie, too large for Hope's head, had been sent in by a local church. Someone embroidered a single yellow sun on it. The stitching was uneven. Someone had tried their best. Kelsey turned toward the hallway and paused. Officer Mercer stood just past the threshold, not stepping inside, just watching. She gave him a small nod and stepped aside without inviting him in. She didn't need to. His presence had become a part of the rhythm now. Some visitors brought balloons, some brought flowers. He brought silence. Graham remained still for a long moment. His eyes didn't leave the baby, but eventually they moved, to the edge of the blanket. He frowned. Something about it. Later in the parking lot, he sat in the cruiser staring at the dashboard, the heater humming low, the blanket. Not the one from the hospital, the one from the woods, the one Hazel had wrapped around Hope. It hadn't been returned to the shelter. It had been laundered, cataloged, evidence technically, but he'd seen it earlier that week in a plastic bag, sealed and stored. There had been something embroidered on it too. He made a call. An hour later, the bag was in his hands. He opened it carefully. A child's blanket, worn at the edges. The embroidery was faint, the thread faded from time and weather. But it was there. A tiny yellow sun, clumsy and crooked, stitched in the same pattern as the hat Hope now wore. He didn't know what it meant yet, but it meant something. That night, back at the cabin, Hazel drank water. Graham didn't react when he saw it, just watched the motion of her head dipping toward the bowl, the way her ears barely lifted. Solace stood close, not hovering, just present. Outside, wind moved across the porch. The sound was softer now, less like warning, more like passing. Graham sat at the table with a notepad in front of him, the blanket laid carefully beside it. He stared at the stitching. Yellow thread, sun, crude, childlike, intentional. He thought of his own childhood, not in images, but in the weight of absence. The things that should have been marked and weren't. Birthdays that passed without mention. School forms signed in unfamiliar handwriting. The first time someone offered him a choice and he didn't know how to answer. How many mothers had meant to stay, but couldn't? How many fathers had passed quietly through the world without being remembered? He pressed his thumb to the fabric and sat there for a long time. The following morning, he brought Hazel back to the clinic. Not because of a medical emergency, she was breathing stronger, moving more, but because he needed to understand. Something about the way Hazel had found that child in the woods. How she hadn't just guarded her, but wrapped her, shielded her, remained. The attending vet, a woman with steady hands and the kind of eyes that never missed a limp, examined Hazel without words at first. Then finally, she's older than she looks, 7, maybe 8. Has a history. Therapy dog? Graham asked. The vet nodded. I'd say so. Maybe hospice, retirement home, somewhere quiet. Her reactions are measured. No fear aggression, just withdrawal. She hesitated, then added, but she's grieving. You know that, right? He did. Back in the car, Hazel rested her chin on Solace's back. Graham glanced at them in the rearview mirror. He drove past the edge of town, then farther, into the rural stretch where roads stopped having names, where trailers sat on tilted foundations and mailboxes leaned like tired shoulders. He didn't know what he was looking for, just that something was pulling him. Near the end of a gravel road, he saw it. A worn mailbox, rusted on the edges, painted with a peeling yellow sun. He stopped. There was no driveway, not really. Just tire tracks in mud and snow. A small house, if it could be called that, sat behind a stand of cedar. Its windows were dark. The porch sagged. A stuffed animal sat on the sill, soaked from the storm. A baby's bottle, frozen solid, stood beside it. No movement, no heat, no one home. Graham didn't get out. He didn't need to. The blanket had come from here, so had the sun. He turned the car around, the tires groaning over wet gravel, the woods watching in stillness. That night, Hazel barked in her sleep. Just once, a short, startled sound. Graham reached over from the couch and placed his hand lightly on her flank. Her breathing slowed. Hope, somewhere across town, curled her fist beneath her chin and slept beneath a light that wasn't harsh anymore. Nothing had been resolved. No one had been found. But something in the story had shifted, and maybe that was enough for now. Snow came quietly that evening, not in storms or sheets, but in the slow, deliberate way that winter tries to hold on a little longer than welcome. It blanketed the porch of Graham's cabin, softened the edge of the forest line, and dusted the shoulders of Hazel, who now sat outside by choice, her body facing east, where the hills rolled low and wide. Inside, Solace slept beneath the table, her breathing even, her body finally still in the way of a dog that no longer expects danger. Graham stood at the sink, a towel over one shoulder, a pot steaming behind him. The house smelled of lentils and garlic, warm and humble. Nothing fancy, just food that filled the air and gave it weight. The kind of smell that clings to memory more than clothes. He watched Hazel through the window. She wasn't trembling anymore, wasn't guarding, just watching, as if some piece of her still waited for a shadow to appear on the snow, for a sound, any sound, that might carry the weight of return. But no one came down the road, no footprints, no headlights, and Graham knew deep down that no one was coming. At the hospital, Hope had passed another small milestone. She turned her head when her name was spoken. That, at least, was what Nurse Kelsey had told him when he called again that morning. She responds, she'd said, not just to noise, to care. That word, it had lodged somewhere in his chest. Care wasn't a job. It wasn't a duty. It was a choice made without guarantee. Later that night, Graham returned to the shelter where the evidence bag had been sealed and stored. Inside the office, under soft yellow light, he unrolled the blanket again, ran his thumb once more across the embroidered sun. He had nearly missed it before, but now he saw. Beneath the yellow stitching, almost invisible in thread, the same color as the cloth, there was a single word, clumsily sewn. Hazel. It wasn't just the dog's name. It was a signature. Someone had made this for her. Someone had named her not as a stray or a tool, but as a companion. A nurse once told him, "The way people name things tells you how they plan to keep them." So then what had happened? Who had Hazel belonged to? Why was she the only one who had stayed? He returned to the cabin with the blanket in hand. Hazel didn't react when he placed it beside her, but she lowered her head to it, resting her jaw gently against the embroidery, as if something old had found its way home. Graham sat beside her on the porch, a mug in his hand. The night around them moved without sound. The world didn't ask questions, but it didn't offer answers either. His voice was barely above breath when he spoke. "She left you with her child, didn't she?" Hazel didn't look up, but she didn't move away either, and for a long time that was enough. It wasn't until the end of that week that Hazel refused food again. The change was small, a slower walk, a heavier pause before settling. But Graham saw it. So did Solace. The vet came to the house that Saturday, not in a white coat, not with machines or tests, just with soft hands, a listening ear, and a blanket she'd carried since her own hospice dog had passed 2 winters ago. "She's old," the vet said quietly. "Older than we thought." Graham nodded. "She's not in pain," she added, "but she's tired. The kind of tired that doesn't ask for more time." He didn't answer. That night, Hazel lay near the stove. Graham didn't light a fire. She didn't need heat. Just space. Just company. Solace curled beside her. Not close, not pressed, but near enough. Graham sat on the floor, his back against the cabinet, knees bent. No music played. No television flickered. Just breathing. Just wood creaking. Just a dog who had given everything she had to something too small to thank her. Around midnight, Hazel exhaled in a way that didn't return. Solace didn't move. Graham didn't speak. Sometimes the truest things in life happen in complete stillness. He sat there until dawn, one hand resting on her side, waiting for the world to remember what it had been given. When the sun finally broke through the trees, it touched Hazel's fur like light remembering where to fall. Graham stood, his joints stiff, his chest hollow. He lifted her gently, wrapped her in the blanket with the sun on it, and stepped out into the snow. Solace followed. There was a small clearing behind the cabin where the pine trees parted in a circle. It wasn't a place he'd ever thought to use, but somehow it felt known, appropriate, like it had been waiting too. He dug slowly, the ground stubborn from frost. He didn't rush. The work wasn't labor. It was remembrance. When the earth was ready, he lowered her down, placed the blanket carefully around her, and stood still as the snow fell again. Not heavy, just enough to soften edges. He said no words. Solace sat nearby, unmoving. Above them, the sky remained a quiet witness. What kind of world lets a creature love that fiercely, only to disappear without noise? And what kind of man finds himself choosing to stay behind, again? Maybe the answer wasn't in the why. Maybe it was in the act of staying itself. Spring didn't arrive with ceremony. It never did in Montana. It crept in quietly, like someone stepping gently into a room where grief had only just begun to loosen its grip. A slight shift in the air, the smell of thawing pine bark, the way snowmelt traced small veins through the soil. These were the signals. Nothing grand, just life remembering how to begin again. On the porch of the cabin, Solace lay beneath the bench, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the edge of the field where the trees met the sky. She hadn't left Hazel's grave since the burial, not entirely. She slept near it, circled it at dawn and dusk, and sometimes simply sat, eyes soft but alert, like she was still waiting for something to stir beneath the soil. Graham didn't stop her. He'd built a simple wooden marker, nothing ornate, just a smooth plank set into the ground with a name burned in. Hazel. Below it, 2 words. She stayed. Each morning, Graham brought coffee out to the porch and sat without speaking. The cup warmed his hands, not much else. He didn't ask himself what was next. He just watched Solace. There was something in her silence that steadied him. A few days after the thaw began, a letter arrived at the sheriff's department addressed to Officer Mercer. It wasn't official mail. The handwriting was uneven, the envelope bent at the corners like it had been carried too long before being mailed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, and a photograph. The photo showed Hazel lying beside a young woman on a worn couch. The woman was heavily pregnant, barefoot, hair tied back with a scarf. She looked tired, but peaceful. Her hand rested gently on Hazel's head. The letter read, "I don't know what you believe about people like me. I'm not asking you to forgive me. But I needed to know someone kind would find her, that someone would stay when I couldn't. She listened when I talked to her belly. She walked beside me when I couldn't breathe. When the pain got too loud, she didn't leave. Not even once. I had nowhere left. No money. No voice anyone would hear. But I had her. And I had the hope that someone would see the sun on her chest and understand what it meant. Not everyone gets that lucky. If you have her, if she stayed with the baby, thank you. Please tell her I didn't mean to go." There was no signature, no return address. Graham read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't show it to anyone, just carried it with him, tucked in the inside pocket of his coat, like a heartbeat. Later that week, he drove back to the hospital. Hope had been moved to a standard crib. Her limbs had filled out slightly, her cheeks flushed with more color now. The staff had begun rotating visitors, reading to her during shifts. Someone had strung a paper mobile of stars and suns above her crib, and one of the nurses played soft, classical music in the afternoons. She kicked now, responded to voices, grabbed fingers. When Graham leaned over the rail and whispered her name, her eyes blinked toward the sound. Not recognition. Not exactly. But something. He didn't reach for her, didn't pick her up, just watched, then asked quietly, "She wrapped you in everything she had." The nurse nearby looked up. "Sorry, officer?" "Nothing," he said. That night, he stood by Hazel's grave again, Solace resting at his side. He didn't light a lantern. The moon was enough. Above them, the stars hung low, bright with the clarity that only came after snow. Graham crouched, brushed some early spring needles from the marker, and spoke. Not loudly, not with pain, just with weight. "She made it," he said. "The girl, she's alive, warm. She kicks." Solace shifted slightly. "She has no one," he added. No name but the one they gave her. But she's not alone. He stood slowly, bones stiff, but heart less so. A breeze moved across the clearing, gentle but sure. Solace lifted her head. 2 days later, Graham requested paperwork from the county office. He didn't ask permission, just followed protocol. The social worker was young, polite, and hesitant. "Sir, you're not listed as a relative," she said, flipping through forms. "Foster applications require—" "I know," Graham replied, "but I want to begin the process." She looked at him, brows raised. "You're sure?" He didn't answer, just passed her the photograph from the envelope. The woman with Hazel, the tired girl with too much love and not enough shelter. "There was love here," he said. "She didn't abandon. She chose." The social worker studied the image, then nodded slowly. "We'll begin the evaluation." Graham left the office in silence. That night, back at the cabin, he placed a folded blanket in the corner of the room. Not Hazel's. He had buried that with her. A new one. Soft. Quietly colored. He set down a small stuffed bear beside it. Not because the baby would be there yet, but because he needed the room to begin changing before she arrived. Solace padded into the room, sniffed the space, then sat near the blanket and waited. It was the waiting, Graham thought, that defined love most. Not the arrival, not the leaving, but the willingness to stay through the not knowing. And here, in a cabin on the edge of Great Falls, where grief had once been the only thing warm enough to cling to, something was beginning again. Without promises, without guarantees, just a man, a dog, and a name spoken gently into the dark. The court hearing was scheduled on a Tuesday morning just after the last snow had melted from the sidewalks and the trees had begun to remember their color. Downtown Great Falls looked the same as it always did. Low buildings, tired flags, and coffee shops where no one seemed to be in a hurry. But for Graham Mercer, the day felt nothing like routine. He stood at the edge of the county courthouse parking lot, holding a folder too thin to feel meaningful, a few papers, a photo, his badge tucked away, not worn. This wasn't about enforcement. It wasn't about policy. It was about standing in front of strangers and saying something that didn't have proof but had weight. He wasn't sure how to dress for that. Solace waited in the truck, head resting on the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the door as if she could follow him with more than sight. She would have come inside if allowed. Maybe she understood more than anyone expected. Maybe that morning she could feel Hazel's absence more sharply, the ache of a role that had never needed a name. Graham entered the building, nodding politely at the security officers. The woman from Child Protective Services, Janice, met him in the waiting area. She had a warm voice, tired eyes, and hands that fidgeted with a paperclip as she spoke. "We've reviewed your file," she said softly. "You meet the preliminary requirements. You've passed background, medical check, financial stability. But today is about intent." Graham looked at her. "Intent?" She hesitated, then nodded. "The court needs to hear why you want to be the one who stays." That word again. Stay. When they were called, the courtroom was quiet. Not empty, but quiet. A judge with salt-white hair and a wool scarf looped loosely around her shoulders sat at the bench. Judge Eliza Kerrigan. Graham had seen her once before during a domestic violence case. He remembered her not for her rulings, but for the way she looked at people when they weren't speaking. The hearing began with formalities. Janice spoke first, outlining the situation, the circumstances of the infant's discovery, the lack of any known family, and the failure to locate the mother. She spoke plainly, but with gentleness. Then came Graham. He stood. No script, no speech. Just a man who had spent too many mornings boiling water in silence with no one waiting for it. "I won't pretend I know what I'm doing," he said. "I'm not young. I'm not good with words. I live in a cabin that's quiet enough to make you forget what noise feels like." He paused. "I was left behind once," he continued, voice steady but low. "A kid in the system. One of the ones nobody picks. I learned how to survive, how to keep the door closed on certain memories. I became a cop, not to fix the world, just so I could be the person who shows up when no one else will." He looked down, then back up. She was found in the snow, wrapped in the body of a dying dog who chose to stay. That dog, Hazel, didn't run, didn't wait for help. She gave everything she had to one small life. He gestured softly. "I don't know what kind of man that makes me, wanting to follow that. But I do know this. If that child wakes up in the middle of the night 5 years from now, afraid, she shouldn't be wondering who she belongs to." Silence held the room for a breath too long. The judge didn't speak right away. She looked toward Janice, then toward the clerk, then finally to Graham. "You've named her?" she asked. Graham nodded. "Hope. That's what they called her at the hospital. I didn't pick it, but I wouldn't change it." A soft smile touched the corners of the judge's mouth. "Sometimes we inherit the names we need." She signed the papers with quiet deliberation. "Temporary guardianship is approved. Full custody hearing to be scheduled in 60 days. In the meantime, Officer Mercer, the child is under your care." Outside, when he returned to the truck, Solace sat upright, tail giving a single soft thump against the seat. Graham opened the door, slipped inside, and sat without starting the engine. "Well," he whispered, "I guess that's that." Solace turned her head slightly, as if to say, "Now it begins." At the cabin, the crib was ready. He had assembled it with a level of precision more fitting for a military operation than parenting. But the lines were smooth, the mattress firm, the mobile above it quiet and slow. No bright colors, just stars and suns, paper cut and handmade by a nurse who had slipped it into the box without asking for thanks. Hope arrived later that week. A social worker delivered her, sleeping in a borrowed carrier with a blanket folded too many times beneath her. No ceremony, no camera flashes, just a small car turning down a gravel road and a man stepping onto his porch with his hands in his coat pockets, wondering how it was possible to be afraid of something that weighed less than 10 pounds. He carried her inside. Solace followed, tail low, eyes steady. Hope stirred once in his arms, gave a small breath, then curled her fingers around the edge of his collar. The house didn't feel full. Not yet, but it no longer felt empty. He laid her down, stood back, and watched as Solace walked to the edge of the crib and lay down beside it, one ear tilted toward the space where Hazel had once waited. The wind moved outside. The trees stood still. And in that quiet, where nothing had to be said and nothing needed to be proven, a new beginning unfolded. Not loud, not sudden, but soft and certain, like a name whispered through snow. Mornings in the cabin came slowly. No alarms, no rush. Just the way light filtered through the pine branches and touched the window pane before it ever reached the crib. Spring had settled in fully now, and though the mountain air still carried a chill, it wasn't the kind that hurt the bones. It was the kind that reminded you were alive. Graham rose early, not from habit anymore, but from rhythm, the kind that forms when someone else's breathing starts to dictate the shape of your day. Hope stirred just past 5. Not with a cry, but with the soft rustle of limbs stretching, reaching. She made small sounds, The kind that weren't quite language but weren't silence either. Sometimes he wondered what it would feel like when she spoke her first word. Would it be a name, a need, or would it simply be sound, honest and untamed? That morning, she lay in her crib with one foot stuck out from beneath the blanket. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the wooden mobile that spun slowly above her. Sun and stars, cut from old cedar, smoothed by hand, hung from threads that had once belonged to his mother's sewing kit, one of the only things Graham had kept from her. Solace lay near the crib, her body curved slightly toward the child. She didn't sleep deeply anymore, not since Hazel. But she rested. She seemed to understand that peace didn't mean forgetting. Outside, the grass had started pushing through old snow patches. The earth, once brittle, was soft beneath boots. Graham carried Hope to the porch, wrapped in a fleece blanket with her name embroidered in one corner. A gift from a nurse named Marion, who had no children, but had quietly crocheted dozens of such blankets over the years for babies no one else claimed. He sat on the top step, the baby cradled in one arm, a mug of coffee balanced carefully in the other. Solace lay at his feet. There was no need for music, no need for speech, just wind in the trees and the sound of Hope's tiny breath, uneven and curious. Across the clearing, a deer passed. Solace lifted her head but didn't bark. She only watched. There had been a time when Graham would have reached for his phone to capture the moment, but now he let it pass. Some things weren't meant to be kept in screens. Some things only existed fully when you didn't try to hold on to them. Later that day, a neighbor passed by, an older man named Lester who owned the property down the road. He didn't stop for long, just leaned on the fence, spoke a few words about the weather, then nodded toward the baby in Graham's arms. "She yours?" Graham had hesitated, then said, "She's here. That's what matters." Lester didn't ask more, just nodded, touched the brim of his cap, and walked on. People in towns like this didn't ask for stories. They noticed if you stayed. That was enough. As the weeks passed, Hope grew. Her weight changed how Graham carried her. Her sounds became more insistent. She smiled now, not just in sleep, but in reaction. Once, when Solace brushed past her toes, Hope let out a soft giggle, more air than voice, but unmistakably real. Graham had stopped what he was doing, looked down, and found himself smiling without realizing it. He didn't tell anyone about it. Some joys belonged to silence. The nights, too, had changed. They were less tense now, less full of listening for sounds that might mean something was wrong. But Graham still woke up sometimes, not from nightmares, but from memory. Hazel's eyes, the cold of that first night, the sound of the baby's breath too shallow in the wind. He'd sit in the hallway with Solace, both of them half awake, the crib a quiet outline down the corridor. He didn't need to check, just needed to remember, just needed to stay near. There were days when grief returned, not loud, but firm, the kind that didn't ask for explanation. On those days, he'd carry Hope wrapped tight to his chest, and they'd walk, through woods, along the creek, across the hill where Hazel was buried beneath pine and stone. He never brought flowers, but he always paused. "She's okay," he'd whisper once, then move on. Hope turned one with no party, no cake, no guests, just a quiet morning where she stood for the first time, one hand on Solace's back, the other gripping the leg of Graham's jeans. It happened just after sunrise when he was putting on coffee, and Solace was waiting for the porch door to open. He looked down, saw her upright, and froze. Hope looked up at him, eyes wide with her own surprise, then fell back gently, landing on the folded quilt she'd been playing on. Graham crouched slowly beside her. "You stood," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Solace wagged her tail once. Hope grabbed at his collar. And for a moment, nothing needed to be said. Not about loss, not about saving, not about what came before. They were here, together, and it was morning. By the time autumn came back around, the cabin no longer felt like a place someone lived in out of habit. It had become a place where things were chosen, where warmth wasn't just heat from the wood stove, but from the quiet rituals that slowly made a life. Morning toast cut into quarters. The squeak of the screen door when Solace pushed through it at dawn. The way Hope now called softly in the dark before sleep, not in fear, but in want. "Duh," she'd murmur from the crib, her voice barely formed, shaped more by breath than by language. And Graham, who had once spent entire winters without hearing his name spoken out loud, would cross the small room, sit beside her, and rest his hand on her back until her breath slowed again. Sometimes he whispered stories, half-remembered things from books or memories or just from watching the stars. He didn't expect her to understand them. He just wanted her to feel the sound of someone staying. That was the thing about Hope. She didn't fill the house with noise the way some children might. She moved through the world carefully, curiously. Her steps were light, her laughter soft, and her silences, the ones where she pressed her ear against Solace's ribs to listen, or stood at the window tracing the rain with her fingertip. Those silences were the heaviest things in the room, but not in a way that burdened, in a way that rooted. Graham had learned not to ask questions out loud that he wasn't ready to answer. But some days, when she was asleep in her cot and Solace was curled nearby, he would look at the ceiling and think, is she ever going to ask where she came from? And if she does, what part of that story do I get to keep for myself? He didn't know. Some truths were bones you buried not because they were shameful, but because they had already done enough breaking. One afternoon in early October, a letter arrived. It came not by mail, but by hand, delivered by an old hospital nurse named Louisa, who'd retired 6 months earlier, but had stopped by town for a visit. She handed Graham the envelope with a shrug. Found this tucked inside a charity donation, no return address, but someone meant for it to land somewhere good. Inside the envelope was a single folded page. No signature. But Graham recognized the handwriting. If she's still alive, thank you. If she's growing, please let her know I never meant to disappear. Sometimes love doesn't look like staying. It looks like stepping away so someone else can. He read the line 3 times. Solace stood behind him in the doorway, ears perked, tail still. Hope was playing in the yard, dragging a stick twice her height while muttering to herself in nonsense language. The wind caught the edges of her jacket and spun leaves in little spirals around her boots. Graham folded the letter, placed it on the mantel beside Hazel's photograph, and stepped out onto the porch. He didn't call for Hope, just stood there and watched. She turned, saw him, and ran. Not quickly, not steadily, but with purpose. Her legs still wobbled, and the stick thudded behind her, but her face lit up in that way only children's faces do, like the world had been waiting to smile through them. He caught her mid-step, lifted her into the air, and she squealed, not from surprise but from recognition, her arms wrapped around his neck, her breath warm against his collar. Solace barked once, then sat down at the edge of the steps like a sentinel made of years and patience. Later that evening, as light fell sideways through the trees, Graham found Hope asleep in his bed, one hand curled around the hem of his flannel shirt, her cheek resting on his pillow. He didn't move her. Just let her sleep there while he sat in the chair across the room, reading with the kind of focus that only grows out of silence. When the wind picked up, he rose, shut the window, and stood there a moment longer than needed, staring out at the dark. He wondered sometimes if Hazel knew the shape her sacrifice had left behind. If dogs could understand legacy. If maybe, in some unseen space, she still watched the girl she saved. Solace padded in, shook off the cold, and lay down beside the crib as she always did. Only now there was no crib. Only a bed too big for one child, but never too small for a life rebuilt. Hope murmured something in her sleep. 2 syllables, muffled and strange. Graham leaned in, listening. It wasn't Da this time, it was Hazel. He didn't know how she knew, and he didn't ask. Instead, he kissed the top of her head, whispered, "She stayed for you," and turned off the light. Some families are written in birth certificates and signatures. Others are made of breath in the cold, paws in the snow, and the sound of someone staying, day after day, without ever needing to explain why. Some stories don't end. They just settle, like snow over pine needles, like silence after a child falls asleep. What began as a trail of paw prints in the cold became a home no one planned, but everyone needed. A man who had once been left behind chose not to leave. A dog who had already given all she had stayed still. And a child who came into this world with nothing was wrapped, again and again, not in blankets, but in love. Not every miracle roars. Some arrive on 4 legs. Some simply breathe beside you, waiting, watching, staying. If this story touched something quiet inside you, tell us in the comments, what does family mean to you now? Or simply type a name, the name of a person or animal who stayed when they could have walked away. And if you believe that even the smallest life deserves to be chosen, don't forget to like and follow. Because sometimes, the stories we share are the ones that keep others going.